They never thought a man who drove an 18-wheeler for a living would become the most dependable person in my life. But he did. And 18 years later, when my mother showed up at my front door with a folder full of financial documents and tears running down her face, I finally understood what it cost her to admit that I was 22 when I told my parents I was pregnant. My father is a corporate attorney, has been for 30 years. The kind of man who irons his shirts on Sunday nights for the whole week ahead, who says things like optics matter and means it in every context. Dinner parties, college applications, the kind of man you bring home. My mother ran a private wealth management firm, downtown. Not a big one, but prestigious enough that her name was on the glass door at the entrance. They had expectations. I knew that. I'd always known that. My boyfriend at the time, the man who would become my husband, drove long-haul trucks. He'd been doing it since he was 20, worked his way up from regional routes to cross-country loads, and by the time I met him at a 4th of July cookout at my college roommate's house, he owned a small share in the trucking company he worked for. He was 30. Funny in a quiet way, and when he laughed with his whole chest. His name was Dale Hutchins from Knoxville, Tennessee, and he had grease under his fingernails that first night, and a smile that made me not care about it at all. We dated for 8 months before I found out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned. We were careful. These things happen anyway. And when I took the test in the bathroom of my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, I sat on the edge of the tub for a long time before I called him. He answered on the second ring, I told him. There was a pause, maybe 4 seconds, and then he said, "Okay, what do you need from me right now?" That was Dale. I drove to my parents' house the following Saturday. My mother made coffee. My father sat at the kitchen island in his weekend clothes, which for him meant a press polo instead of a dress shirt. I told them I was pregnant. I told them the father was Dale. My mother set down her mug very carefully. My father looked at me the way he looked at cases he'd already decided were losers. "How far along?" he asked. 9 weeks. He nodded once. Then he asked about Dale's income, his education, his prosactal. He actually used that word, trajectory. I told him Dale was a co-owner in a trucking operation, that he made good money, that he was responsible and kind. My father asked what college he'd graduated from. I told him. Dale hadn't gone to college. The silence in that kitchen was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My mother spoke first. She said she thought I should consider my options. I told her I had. I was keeping the baby. My father pushed off the counter and said, "You understand what you're doing to yourself, not a question. A verdict." I drove home that afternoon, thinking it hadn't gone well but that it would get better. That. Once they met Dale properly, once they saw how he was with me, it would get better. People come around. That's what I told myself. They didn't come around. 3 weeks later, my father called and told me that, until I was willing to make responsible choices, they wouldn't be providing any further financial support. I was still on their health insurance. That stopped too. He said it wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. He said he'd done the math and enabling my situation wasn't something he was willing to do. My mother didn't call separately. She never did, when he'd already spoken. Dale and I moved in together that month. He had a 2-bedroom house he was renting in a suburb outside Columbus. Nothing fancy. Hardwood floors that creaked, and a furnace that took forever to kick on in winter. I decorated it with stuff from Target and a second-hand rug I found on Facebook Marketplace. I got on Dale's insurance through his company plan. I switched to a midwife practice that accepted it. I finished my last semester of school online, delayed graduation by 1 term, and walked the following December with my daughter on my hip in a photograph that is still my favorite picture I have ever taken. We named her June. She was born on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 pounds and 4 ounces. The most stubbornly calm baby the nurses said they'd seen in a while. Dale cried in the delivery room. I didn't. I was too tired, but I cried later, in the dark, while she was sleeping on my chest, and he was asleep in the chair beside me, and I thought about how my parents weren't there, and how I didn't want them to be anymore. We got married the following spring. Small ceremony, backyard of Dale's parents' house in Knoxville, his mother's garden in full bloom. 20 people, maybe. My college roommate was my maid of honor. My side of the aisle had 4 people in it, all friends, no family. I had blocked my parents' numbers by then, not out of anger, exactly. Out of survival. You can only wait for a door to open so many times before you accept. It's been bolted from the other side. The years that followed were not easy in the way people romanticize. There was no movie montage of us laughing over ramen while we built our dreams. Ad scene guests. We fought about money in ways that felt like we were talking about something else entirely. Dale was on the road 4, sometimes 5 days a week, during heavy freight seasons. I was home with June, working part-time as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. Trying to hold things together on a schedule that made no logical sense. There were nights I was so tired. I sat in my car in the garage for 10 minutes after getting home, just to have 10 minutes that were only mine. But Dale showed up. Every time he came home all the way. He didn't need to be coached on how to be a father. He just was one. He took June to her pediatric appointments on the days he was home, memorized the names of her stuffed animals, learned to do her hair in 2 braids, because she went through a phase where that was the only acceptable option. When she started kindergarten and cried at drop-off, for 3 weeks straight, he rearranged his schedule to do the drop-off every morning so she could get used to it with him. He said, "She'll feel safer working through it if it's me." He was right. The trucking business grew. Dale's company expanded to a regional fleet, and his equity stake grew with it. By the time June was 7, we'd bought a house. A real one, 4 bedrooms, good school district, the kind of house I'd have been embarrassed to describe to my parents because it would have sounded like I was trying to prove something. I wasn't. It was just the life we'd built. I thought about my parents sometimes, not constantly, not obsessively. But they were there, in the back of things, at June's birthday parties, at parent-teacher conferences, when the other grandparents showed up, at holidays when Dale's family gathered around the table, and the space where my own family should have been was just quietly, permanently empty. June asked about them once. When she was 9. She'd seen a photo, an old one, that had fallen out of a box I was sorting. "Who are they?" she asked. I told her they were my parents. She asked why she'd never met them. I told her we weren't close. She accepted that the way children accept things that are presented as simply true. I didn't tell her the rest. She didn't need it yet. When June was 12, Dale's trucking company was acquired by a regional logistics firm out of Nashville. The buyout was significant. Not retire on a yacht significant, but changed the trajectory of your life significant. The kind of money that meant June's college was covered, and we had options we'd never had before. Dale invested some of it, paid off the house, and used a portion to start a smaller independent freight brokerage with a partner he trusted. He was 46 years old, and starting over in a way that felt earned rather than reckless. I went back to school. June was in middle school by then and didn't need me every minute in the way she once had, and I enrolled in an accounting program and eventually got my CPA license. I opened a small practice 3 years later. Mostly small business clients, a few individuals. Nothing like my mother's firm. But mine. My name on the glass. June turned 18 and decided she wanted to study environmental engineering at Ohio State. She was the kind of student who had always made things look easy, but who you could tell, if you watched closely, worked harder than almost anyone around her. She got an early decision. The night she found out. Dale ordered pizza, and we sat on the kitchen floor with the boxes between us, because the table felt too formal for the occasion, and we laughed about nothing for an hour and a half. It was one of the best nights I can remember. 3 months before June left for college, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. I was in the middle of a client call and let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from my mother. Her voicemail was from my mother. Sound when they've aged faster than expected, she said. She was sorry to bother me. She said she'd been trying to find the right time to call for years and kept putting it off. And now there wasn't time to put things off anymore. She said, my father had been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's 2 years prior, and that things had progressed faster than the doctors anticipated. She said the care was expensive. Full-time memory care facilities in Columbus run between $8,000 and $12,000 a month, and they were burning through their savings faster than she'd expected. Her firm had closed during the pandemic and hadn't fully recovered. She said she wasn't calling to ask for money. Then she asked if I would be willing to meet. Crane. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office for 20 minutes after listening to that voicemail. I didn't cry. I felt something, but I couldn't name it. It was too layered, grief and anger, and something that it wasn't quite pity but lived in the same neighborhood. I called Dale that night after dinner. June was upstairs. I told him about the voicemail. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities. And when I finished, he said, what do you want to do? Not what he thought I should do. What I wanted. I said I didn't know yet. I called my mother back the following week. We talked for 40 minutes, she cried. Once. Briefly. And apologized for it. Which made it worse somehow. She told me things I hadn't known. That she had tried to call twice over the years and hadn't left messages because she didn't know what to say. That she had kept a photograph of me from before everything fell apart on her nightstand for years. Before, my father moved it because looking at it made him uncomfortable. That when she found out about June from a mutual family friend years ago, just that I had a daughter, not much more. She had pulled her car over and sat there for half an hour. I don't know if any of that changes anything. I don't know if it's supposed to. She asked to meet June. She said she understood if the answer was no. She said my father's condition meant he may not have many more months of clarity, and she didn't want to make that my problem. But she wanted to be honest. I didn't answer that question on the call. I talked to June. I told her everything. The whole story. Go, bird. Not the edited version. Not the, we just weren't close. She sat at the kitchen table and listened with the same focused stillness she'd had since she was small, the kind that made you feel like your words were landing somewhere they kept. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, do you want to see her? I said, I didn't know. She said, then, maybe start there. She's going to be a good engineer. She thinks in terms of problems that have solutions and asks the right questions to find. And asks the right questions to find them. I have always thought that trait came from Dale. But sitting there, watching her think, I saw something of myself in it too. My mother came to the house on a Thursday afternoon in October. She drove herself. She looked older. Of course she did. It had been 18 years. And smaller. Somehow, the way people look when the authority they carried has been quietly set down over time. She brought nothing. No gift, no flowers. I respected that. It would have felt like a transaction. We sat in the kitchen. I made coffee. Dale was at work. June was at school. We talked for 3 hours. Not about everything. Not about fixing things, or resuming something that had stopped, or pretending the years were a temporary gap, rather than a deliberate one. We talked about what had happened and why. She told me my father had softened about Dale years ago, and never said so, because he didn't know how to. She said the moment he stopped being able to remember things consistently was the moment she understood how much he had never said to the people he loved. I told her about June's braids in Dale's floor, pizza nights, and my name on the glass door of my office. She cried. I didn't stop her. Before she left, she asked again about meeting June. I told her June knew she was here today. That it was June's choice. She nodded. She said that was fair. June came home from school at 3:30 and found my mother still sitting at my kitchen table with a second cup of coffee going cold in front of her. They looked at each other across the room for a moment. My daughter and my mother, strangers who shared something neither of them had asked for. And then June said, "Hi, I'm June," and sat down across from her. I stood in the doorway and watched them and didn't say anything. Whatever comes next, I can't predict. I don't know if my mother and I will build something from this, or if this is all there is, a Thursday afternoon, and 2 cups of coffee and 18 years. Acknowledged if not undone. I don't know if June will want a grandmother or an acquaintance, or nothing at all, and I've made peace with the fact that it's her choice to make, not mine. What I know is this: Dale was home by 6. He set his keys on the counter and looked at me across the kitchen and didn't ask anything. Just read the situation the way he always does, and came over and put his arm around me and said, we quietly. You okay? I leaned into him and thought about the 4th of July cookout where I met him, the 4 seconds of silence before he said, "What do you need?" The creak of that rental house floor. The braids. The pizza boxes. 18 years of a man who showed up every single time. Yeah, I said, I think I actually am.